all the contrarian plays, all the sleepers here in week 6, a week full of many question marks, many questionable players, but we'll walk you through the minefield that we're currently facing down right now. I'm Chris Spags, joined as always by the top daily fantasy sports player in the world, the namesake of this YouTube channel and the website, Osmo.com, Alex Osmo Baker. How are you doing, Alex?
Doing well, man. I gotta take a victory lap right off the bat here. We said last week that it was gonna be one of the best weeks of fantasy football of all time, and it was. This week, I think we got a lot of good games to talk about, a lot of competitive games where in previous weeks we saw a lot of really lopsided matchups. So I think we should be able to dig out some really big sleepers here.
Yeah, we're going to have a lot to hit on, as I'm sure, and you are right. That was the highest score. I guess it depends on how chalky your lineups were. If it was a good week or a bad week, but it was definitely a high-scoring week, and hopefully we can keep that momentum going with our guest this week from Football Guys, one of the top players in the world, a world fantasy football champion, Steve Buzzard. How are you doing, Steve?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on this week. Looking forward to breaking down some of the contrarian picks of the week. Last couple of weeks, the contrarian picks haven't done as well, so hopefully this is the week that they kind of break that trend and do a little bit better. Kind of a really crazy week so far, too, with the injuries, so we'll have a lot to talk about on that front also.
Yeah, we got a lot of question marks heading into tomorrow. Also, it looks like we're not live on YouTube yet. I'm not sure if it's a delay or what.
Sorry, hold on.
Did we not actually start?
I forgot we have this new system here, so me.
Yeah, we might be live on Periscope. I don't know how that works.
I think we might be live on Periscope. Yeah.
All right, Periscope, hang in there. We're gonna. YouTube is just as important as you guys. They deserve their rights represented as well.
All right, I think we should be good to go on the link I tweeted out here.
Do I just pretend that we didn't do? I mean, hey YouTube, welcome on board. We've been doing the show for about 30 seconds.
I think it'll show like the stuff we did. It was just on the wrong link.
Got it. Okay. All right. So yeah, well, let's keep it going then, and let's also give a quick thank you then. YouTube, welcome on board. We'll give you a quick thank you to our supporters here at Fantasy Draft, one of the better sites out there, the official home of rake-free daily fantasy sports in the entire DFS universe. If you want to go play rake-free daily fantasy, go to fantasydraft.com. Once again, they're bringing the heat with a $500,000 guaranteed rake-free contest, the Hooters main event. And it is the largest and only rake-free contest you will find in the world of DFS for week 6. So go to fantasydraft.com right now and use the promo code AWESEMO, AWESEMO, for your free 7-day trial. Alex, we always like to ask you this question first. How much money would you have saved on Rake this week if you were playing exclusively on Fantasy Draft?
Well, I think the main event is usually about $30, and you're saving about 10% in Rake every time you enter. So that's $3 per entry, and at a rate of about $1 per wing. If you enter a lot of times, you could be saving up to 450 wings per Sunday you play fantasy football.
Yeah, I mean, look, the wing value there is certainly a big one. Steve, you're playing there as well, too, right? And you're a guy who's won on a lot of sites. How are you finding the experience on Fantasy Draft?
Yeah, absolutely loving Fantasy Draft. One of the calculations I kind of did is basically it comes out to once every 6 weeks you're basically playing rate with no cost. So this is the week, right? Week 6 to play for free essentially. So really good stuff there.
Yeah, Fantasy Draft, a great site for players out there. And again, all the entry fees are going to the winners, and that's what you want to see out of a DFS site. So go support them, go support the show, go to fantasydraft.com right now. Use that promo code AWESEMO, AWESEMO, for your free 7-day trial. All right, so Steve, you're over at Football Guys. You've also, again, you are a world champion of fantasy football, which there are not a lot of you guys out there in the world. As a person who does content and is also playing and has won some big money, what would you say are the things you've learned in those big money tournaments, which maybe you're applying on a week-to-week basis?
Right. So it's a big difference between playing the live finals versus playing the Weekly Millionaire Maker or something like that. Probably the biggest thing that I like to take into consideration is kind of the namesake of the show, being a little bit contrarian each week, making sure that you're not putting all the chalk players in your lineup, but at the same time not really going overboard on completely fading all the chalk players as well. It's kind of having that mix between the two. So Some of the guys in my lineups that won me the big dollars were less than 1% owned. So don't be afraid to click that button and get those guys in there. But don't be afraid to play those guys that are 20% owned as well, because a lot of times I have maybe one of those guys in the lineup as well. So
and even those 1%
guys,
I'm sure for you are not the flimsiest 1% guys. Like it's not guys getting 3 targets. It's guys who just people are overlooking in some way.
Right, absolutely. Like for instance, I think I was the maybe one or only 2 people that had Matt Ryan and Julio Jones in the final event, just because it was a tough matchup. And majority of the time, you're going to think Matt Ryan, Julio Jones. Nothing wrong with those guys.
Yeah, I mean, certainly 2 players we're going to talk about this week. And actually, let's just get right into it because this game is looking like one of the chalkier ones out there. And we did just get an ownership update as well right before the show started. And it looks like Atlanta getting even chalkier by the update. Of course, if you want to get our ownership projections, go to osmo.com/join. Use the promo code CONTRARY and get half off your first month of any Osmo Plus package. Or you can also find packages as low as $3.95 a week. But either way, go to osmo.com/join. We have a helpful tool there to help you find a package that works best for you. And this data is going to help you make better lineups. So let's get into it. Atlanta and Arizona. Once again, a team against the fast-paced Arizona side is going to be expected to be highly owned. Except this time, unlike Cincinnati last week, the team is actually kind of good, at least offensively. Steve, you're a Falcons expert here, so I'll turn to you first. Who would be the guys you trust the most on Atlanta here going against a spot? I mean, we've seen it time and time again. Arizona's pace is offering up a lot of opportunity for opposing teams.
Right. So I like the spot here for Atlanta. I do prefer to play Atlanta quite a bit, pretty much every week. It's helped me out in a lot of different spots. But this is another good spot. They continue to get paced up. Atlanta is going to have no problem throwing the ball against the Cardinals. So certainly like Matt Ryan, he is going to be one of the most chalkiest plays. So if you are going with Matt Ryan, do make sure you get some other contrarian plays into your lineup somewhere else. But I like pairing Ryan up with Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, Sanu as well. The other guy that's going to be really super chalky is Austin Hooper. He's had 6 targets in all but 1 game so far this year. Everyone loves targeting the Cardinals. They're giving up, I think, 75% more points than expected to their opponents, and that's going to make him super high owned. So if I'm going to go against the grain on the Falcons, it might be fading Austin Hooper and kind of loading up on some of those other wide receivers instead.
Yeah, Arizona on the year giving up a 45% boost according to DVOA to tight ends, and they have been one of those funnel spots that's talked about in a lot of the podcast industry wide. So Austin Hooper going to be very popular. Alex, how are you feeling about Atlanta? Because the thing that always sticks out to me with Atlanta, especially this year, they're spreading the ball around at a pretty high clip. You have 5 guys getting over 5.2 targets per game. Austin Hooper and Julio Jones, the highest targeted. So those are the guys you're going to assume are safe. But you've had weeks where Sanu goes off. You've had weeks where Ridley goes off. How are you feeling about the stack, and who be the guys that you prefer?
Yeah, I mean, I really like Atlanta this week, even though they are chalky. Matt Ryan just throws the ball at such a high rate. They don't rely on the run game too much in Atlanta. I've been expecting some more runs this week because the matchup versus Arizona is favorable for them. But he has so many good targets because he throws so much with Hooper, Julio Jones, Ridley, Sanu. All these guys are kind of in play for me, and I'm just going to mix and match, hope to hit the right combo. We won't know because there's a lot of randomness in who gets the targets from week to week. So it'll be just a matter of getting lucky and picking the right ones if Ryan goes off.
Is Devonta Freeman in the mix for you? Because he's the guy he's kind of the benchmark where he's the one who's getting 5.2 targets, but all these other guys getting targeted as well. But Freeman does seem like a guy who's getting less ownership. I guess he's right on par currently in our ownership projections with Ridley and Sanu. Would he be somebody you would stack with Ryan? I guess how many guys are you willing to go to in this Atlanta offense in one stack?
I probably wouldn't love stacking Freeman with Ryan. I wouldn't avoid it, but I wouldn't go out of my way to do it. But Freeman is a great play individually. If Atlanta gets up, he should get a large number of running attempts. And we've seen in the past, he has the potential to go off for 3 touchdowns in a given week. It's been a few years since that happened, but... this could be the week. I mean, there's the highest chance this week of any.
Yeah, he's definitely due for some positive rushing TD regression. No rushing TDs on the year so far for Devonta Freeman, but involved in the pass game. Alex, how about the Arizona side? Because they have had some production. Well, we do have a questionable David Johnson, a questionable Christian Kirk. We saw how the offense kind of slows down, kind of, I guess, clogs up a little bit without those guys last week. Though Johnson was in there, just maybe not peak effectiveness. Christian Kirk not being in there, it did seem like it hurt them. Which Arizona players would you want to run it back with if you are going to have those Atlanta stacks?
Well, David Johnson is questionable. He says he's going to play, but if he does end up playing, I think he'd be a reasonable guy. Someone who's hasn't really had a breakout week this year so far, but he's been getting the volume. And then I really like Larry Fitzgerald and Christian Kirk. I think that if there's a lot of passing in this game, there'll be more plays for both sides, and that could be a huge fancy game stack for you if you have both sides of this game, and there's both quarterbacks are having to throw the ball a lot.
Steve, how are you feeling about Arizona? Because they do have some guys, theoretically, if you are going to be stacking up Atlanta, you want to run it back with somebody. Who'd be the one that you'd want the most on the Arizona side?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of the things that Alex was just saying there. The injury from Christian Kirk is a little bit worrisome, so it'll be really interesting to see if we get any information on that overnight, because this is a late game, I believe, the 4 o'clock slate. So if we don't get any news prior to the lock early, Christian Kirk may be quite underowned. And one actual good, interesting pivot for him in the same game is actually Sanu. So you could, if you wanted to have Christian Kirk in your lineups temporarily, and if he did scratch, you could flip over to Sanu at a similar price point at the same game, or potentially Keyshawn Johnson is a little bit lower as well. So I don't mind taking some chances on Kirk in case he's healthy. Fitzgerald as well. He's starting to slow down a little bit. I don't know if that's his age catching up with him a little bit. Finally, he's had an amazing career, but is he starting to slow down from that side a little bit as well? And then finally, it'd be interesting, right? We talked about the David Johnson injury. If he's good to go, I think his ownership might start ticking down to a more reasonable spot. He was the highest owned player last week on both DraftKings and FanDuel. If his ownership ticks down to a reasonable spot, I think that might be a interesting spot for him as well.
Yeah, certainly a key status to watch here, because if he's not playing, Chase Edmonds actually, you can argue, has been as effective in a lower volume role, and would certainly be a player there at a cheap price point who could be in the mix. Let's keep going, because we actually have another guy who seems like he's picking up a lot of ownership now. Reports are out there. Todd Gurley doubtful for tomorrow, I believe a thigh contusion. So that's not great for him, but it does open up some opportunity for Malcolm Brown in a game with San Francisco heading into LA to face the Rams. The Rams team total, one of the higher ones on the week, though it has started to trickle down a bit here. But Malcolm Brown projected to be a chalky play at a similar price point to Chase Edmonds, and a guy who should theoretically see some volume without Gurley out there. Alex, how are you feeling about Malcolm Brown's prospects here going against? So to me, I think San Francisco's defense is really good, and I think you may feel differently, and maybe you and Steve both do. But I think they've shown a lot of signs here where I think this could be a tough spot for the Rams, and we'll talk about it as we go. But how are you feeling about Malcolm Brown just picking up that volume that Gurley leaves behind?
I feel good about him, but not great. I think that the spot wasn't that good to begin with Gurley, because San Francisco is a tougher than average matchup. The Rams have a team total of 27 this week, which is a little bit less than normal. Only about a 60% chance to win this game, which is a lot lower than their win percentage since last year of 73%. So I don't think the matchup is particularly great for running backs, and Malcolm Brown probably not going to get targeted as much as Gurley when he's out there running routes. So I think he ends up being a pretty good play, but he's not a complete lock. The one site where I think he is probably the best of any is Yahoo, where he's only $10. He actually isn't that close to the minimum on DraftKings and Fantasydraft. FanDuel also at $4,800. That's a pretty appealing salary.
Steve, how are you feeling about Malcolm Brown? And I guess just the volume, is that enough for you to make him a play, or are you concerned about not seeing passing volume and maybe just not being as valuable in the spot versus San Francisco?
Yeah, I do think his targets will be limited. We haven't seen him get a lot of targets this year, certainly not as much as what Gurley would typically get. I think he's about 20% lower. Although we haven't seen Malcolm Brown a lot, right? So we don't know if he's in on every play. will they use him a little bit differently? We also don't know exactly how much they're planning on using Darrell Henderson. I think he's only seen 2 snaps this year, but with the way that the Rams run the ball, the way that they plan their offense, they kind of plug in those running backs pretty easily. The way we saw C.J. Anderson doing his thing last year, so it wouldn't surprise me if they split up the carries a little bit more than what you're expecting from the get-go. Also, his ownership is going to be pretty high, so that worries me as well. But I kind of faded Gallman and Auden Tate and Disley and Aguilar the last couple of weeks, all in similar type of spots, and they all kind of backfired on me. So probably going to be a little bit more cautious this time.
I mean, still a case where, we've had this debate. Actually, let's talk about this. We've talked about this a bit on Live Before Lock with Josh Engelman, one of our smarter guys who does a lot of our streams. And he was very anti-Will Disley a couple weeks ago. I was more on the pro side because I thought he opened some things up, and I wasn't as confident in some of the other tight end plays. But I want to turn this to both of you guys. You guys are both gigantic winners in these tournaments. How do you approach a chalk play? I mean, Steve, you mentioned Aguilar, Disley, Gallman, some of these guys who've looked pretty good, but still could be dicey in that spot. So I'll ask you first, Steve, how are you approaching these guys for the most part? Are you just trying to have some exposure but stay under the field? Are you avoiding them entirely and just going to different price points? How do you handle that week to week?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I don't have a set rule for any single person. I put in my projections and ownerships, and if they come out as a good play, then I'll play them. If they don't, then I won't. Unfortunately, I've kind of, my calculations have been off a little bit on some of those guys this year, saying that they weren't good plays, and kind of it's showing that a little bit towards Malcolm Brown again this week as well. So kind of hesitant to go.
Sorry, I thought you were done. My bad.
Yep. So probably we'll get a little bit of him, but certainly won't go overboard.
Alex, how do you feel about that? Because, again, some of these guys have projected well for you, but just in a tournament strategy approach, like Steve is mentioning, it may make sense to go away from them. Or if the projection is comparable to another guy, just to go to a guy who's got a little more secure volume, more secure floor. How are you handling these guys every week that are coming up as chalk? And Malcolm Brown, maybe not your guy, but the similar cases.
Well, Steve, first I'll give you a pep talk here, man. You weren't wrong. You were just unlucky. We're never wrong with our picks here, especially when they're contrarian ones. But I think that the main thing I'm looking at here in this particular spot is opportunity cost. So there are some running backs this week in the mid-range that I just absolutely love. So it's going to take a lot for me to go down to a value running back. And I think there are some others other than Malcolm Brown that are in the mix. So I'll probably spread out my exposure between a few different guys. Probably have some Malcolm Brown. But if people are just expecting him to be the next Todd Gurley, I really think Darrell Henderson is going to step in and get a decent amount of the work. So it's not going to be all Malcolm Brown this week.
Okay, so let's talk about the receivers here because Cooper Kupp's going to be pretty decently owned. Robert Woods as well going to have some ownership. And so what jumps out to me, and this is something for the Monday night game with the Browns and the Niners, where I really think the Niners defense is good. And I think Jared Goff has some very particular flaws. Very bad when he's pressured. He's only got we have a 68.6 QB rating under pressure for Goff on the year. And also when he has to hold on to the ball over 2.5 seconds, he drops to a 63.8 QB rating. So he's really bad under pressure. He's really bad when he's having to hold on to the ball. I think San Francisco does a really good job covering guys, and I see them bringing pressure as well at a high rate. They're getting a good sack rate. So Alex, do these things ever enter the equation for you? Because we have a high Vegas total, but again, the Niners defense has looked good, and they've done a good job also kind of stymieing similar passers who have similar failings.
Well, I think it comes into play with the pricing because the Rams are going to be priced according to how talented they are, given their performance over the year so far. And when you have a tough matchup versus San Francisco, that ends up with them being a little bit overpriced. So it makes it a situation where you're giving up a lot in as far as other players you can get in your roster by going for a Ram stack, because they end up being one of the more expensive ones per week. So really, you want to go for them when it's a great matchup.
That makes sense. Steve, how are you feeling about these guys? And Cooper Kupp in particular, he's been the safety blanket for Jared Goff for a while, running out of the slot. Theoretically, he should have a better matchup coming out of the slot because he's not going to be getting Richard Sherman on the outside. How are you feeling about Kupp and I guess this passing attack for the Rams overall?
Yeah, the Rams are really pretty interesting. I feel like for the last year and a half or so, everyone said basically Cup, Woods, Cooks are all kind of one, and they're all equal. But it's not really been the case. Cup has been getting a lot more of the targets over the last basically all the time that he's been healthy, and it's really paid, and it's really showed this year too. Finally, the sites have started to price them that way. So now Cup is more expensive than Woods and Cook. So maybe it's a time to shift over to Woods and Cooks and see if really the talk that these guys are all the same was kind of a little bit more true. So maybe give them a little bit of a shout out, and don't really hate kind of an under the radar play of Gerald Everett as well. The Rams did play a little bit more to tight ends last week than what they had been playing. Typically, they've always been playing the three wide and one tight end almost all the plays, and that they've kind of split that up and played a lot more two tight end last week. Will that continue this week without Gurley? Not 100% sure, but it could be an opportunity to get some targets for Everett at low ownership and kind of a good pivot off of some of the other wide receivers.
Yeah, Everett just 1.6 targets behind Brandon Cooks so far in the year. Cooks getting 6.8 per game, Everett getting 5.2. And as Steve mentioned, Cooper Kupp leading the way by a pretty decent margin now. 12.6 targets a game for Cooper Kupp. That's a lot for him. How about the other side, Alex? And I'll ask you first. Probably not a ton of interest because there isn't a lot of ownership to these guys, but maybe you have some. They've really been running the ball down people's throats, and that's been something, just from a games film perspective, a lot of the podcasts that I listen to kind of stay sharp. I've been talking about that. A lot of creative run designs, and they just keep getting success with a really good run blocking line, well graded by PFF. How are you feeling about the running attack or George Kittle, who's going to be a very chalky play? I guess these are two things to look at here for San Francisco.
I think the running attack is. It would be good if they had a two-man backfield, but right now they're kind of splitting it between three guys, and that makes it pretty hard to get to with Mostert, Coleman, and Breida. I even saw that there was a report that Jeff Wilson may be active, and that may take a carry or two away from some of these guys. So I think the last game we saw versus the Browns, they were just up the entire game. That's probably why they ran so much. So I think that Rams were their dog. They should have to throw the ball a lot more. And I think George Kittle seems to be the only real great fantasy option because their wide receiver rotation just is full of guys that haven't been able to produce a ton for fantasy. So I can understand what George Kittle is kind of the focal point of fantasy lineups with the 49ers players here.
Is there any concern for you at all with the amount of routes that he's been running? Because this has been something that jumped out to me every week. He's only running 22.8 routes per game. And that, as you mentioned, that could be a symptom of them being up in some games and running the ball more. But the targets have been there. He's getting over 7 targets a game. But if you see a signifier like that where the guy's running less routes or maybe just not as involved in the passing attack or is involved but in sort of a limited sample size, does it give you any pause for George Kittle as a chalk play?
I think so, but I'm incorporating that into my projections here. I think he's been running a route on about 3/4 of 49ers pass plays so far this year. They haven't passed the ball a ton. They've only run 131 passing plays over their first 4 games, which is extremely low. So I think that if they pass the ball a normal amount of times, Kittle should be in a good spot here.
Steve, how are you feeling about George Kittle here? Because he's a pivot to a guy in Austin Hooper. You mentioned going to be as owned, or at least comparably owned. Is Kittle a guy you want to go to this week at a fairly reasonable price, but perhaps with some risk?
Yeah, so I just ran some crunches right before the show just to kind of see where some of my guys are falling. And especially if you look over on Fantasydraft, George Kittle's prices really quite good where you can play a couple of different flex positions over there. So he was coming up quite a bit over there. He is running a lot less routes and getting a lot less targets per route so far this year. He's still getting fair amount. I don't have it offhand what his targets per route are, but I think they're pretty good. But the fact that he hasn't scored a touchdown and he hasn't done as well so far this year. I think he has 1 touchdown, but he didn't have it by the time the pricing was out last for this week. I think the sites have bumped his pricing down so much that it kind of accounts for a lot of the risk of him not doing as well. And this is a game that they're going to have to keep up with the Rams and likely pass a little bit more. So I think going with Kittle, as long as he's healthy, is a fine play.
Kittle getting targeted 32% of the time when running a route, which is one of the higher numbers overall compared to guys like Mark Andrews, who's actually also very high, but he's only at 30%. So that is something to know with Kittle, where if he's not running less routes, he is heavily involved whenever he is running one. Let's keep going here. And guys, of course, watching this video right now, please hit that like button, because all the things that we talk about here, the data is always going to be good, but the takes are only good if the like button is hit. So please hit that like button. Otherwise, you're only failing yourself and everybody watching the video. So please do that right now for us. And let's talk, speaking of takes, there's got to be some to go around here. Houston at Kansas City, a game that should be a shootout. Houston last week went nuts. Deshaun Watson hitting a ceiling game. Will Fuller going bananas, and also could benefit again. Kenny Stills, a game time decision. So that opened up a lot for Fuller last week, theoretically. And now Fuller going to have that same opportunity in front of him again. Kansas City, Patrick Mahomes banged up, but we also have Tyreek Hill possibly returning as well. He will also be a questionable call. It's going to be a game time decision. The tea leaves seem to be going towards him playing. So, Alex, I'll ask you first. Which side do you prefer here? Are you trying to go to Houston for the full stack more? Are you trying to go to Kansas City? Which side would you want?
I think both sides are probably, the top options of the week. I think that Houston gets the bigger bump as far as overall performance because Kansas City's offense is really strong, and Houston should have to pass the ball a lot this week to stay in the game. In addition, I think that Kansas City has trouble getting their defense off the field, so opposing teams tend to have a lot of success sustaining drives. So I think that all adds up to a pretty big potential performance for Deshaun Watson, for Will Fuller, and Hopkins. So I think those guys are all going to be top plays of the week.
Steve, how are you feeling about Houston? They went off last week. Will Fuller, probably going to see some people chasing that game, but also people want to go back to DeAndre Hopkins. He'll be one of the chalkiest plays on the week on most of the sites, it seems. Seems like he's on the cusp of a breakout game, perhaps, but just hasn't quite gotten there. How are you feeling about Houston's passing attack, and who are the guys that you prefer?
Yeah, I think all of them are really in play again for a lot of the same reasons. I think they're going to have to keep up with Kansas City, and that's going to lead to them tossing quite a few passes to Hopkins, Fuller, Kute, and potentially Stills if he is active. I think an interesting thing will be the ownership between Hopkins and Fuller. So Fuller had that huge game, and a lot of people were paying attention to that last week because they likely won a lot of money with him. They're likely to play him again this week. So it'll be interesting to see which of those is higher owned on kind of my final ownership projections that I do over at Football Guys. I know you guys do as well. But if Fuller gets up as high as what I'm thinking he might end up getting to, I'm a little bit worried about him. He's kind of that boom or bust guy that you like to play when he's a little bit lower owned and not as much when he's higher owned. Of course, last week he was higher owned and it worked as well. But and then the hesitation I have a little bit with DeAndre Hopkins is he's just had a lot more competition for for targets this year with Fuller, with Kute being more healthy. Both of those guys Stills added to the team. So he didn't used to have that much competition in the past. So his targets per snap are down slightly this year, and that's kind of driving his performance so far. So hopefully, as Kuti and Fuller and some of these guys keep doing well, that's going to start allowing defenses to pay a little bit more attention to those guys and not focus as much on Hopkins. And hopefully that will give him a chance to have a big game. So it's coming soon, and this could be that game for it.
Yeah, certainly the tight ends too probably due for some negative TD regression. They've been taking a lot off the table, both Akins and Darren Fells. And one would hope that would give some more to Hopkins. Steve, you're a Colts guy, as I could tell by your hat. So you probably saw a couple weeks ago what the Colts did to Kansas City, a heavy run approach here. Would that make Carlos Hyde in play for you? Because the Chiefs, one of the worst teams in the league against anything on the ground, giving up 5.3 yards per rush, bringing up pretty poorly according to PFF as well. Are you going to any Carlos Hyde at all this week as a lower owned pivot to some of that high owned Houston?
Yeah, I think he's a reasonable guy to take a shot with. His price is down quite low. He's getting all the red zone work or goal line work, actually. I think he has pretty much all of the touches within 5 yards. So that's a really good sign if they get down close. If Fuller steps out on the 1 yard line again, there's a good chance that Hyde will get some of that work. So I think he's a fair play. I don't think he's nearly as good as Mac to be able to control the game the way Mac did, but he'll get some work and is a worthwhile shot.
Alex, how are you feeling about Carlos Hyde? Because he is kind of a price point pivot to some of the guys we talked about, the Malcolm Browns out there. Is he somebody you'll have any exposure to? Because it looks like the field's not going to be on him terribly heavily, but a decent swath of ownership, it seems.
Yeah, I feel good about Hyde. I think that he makes a good alternative to some of the passing attacks in this game. If you're playing for the Houston, kind of unexpectedly is controlling the game here, Hyde could get a huge workload. I've been projected for 14 rushes, so that leaves some room for upside as far as rushing attempts. And he's getting a couple targets a game in the passing game, so I think that it all adds up to a pretty reasonable value play.
How about the Kansas City side? Because we have some questions about Patrick Mahomes' health. He's a little banged up there. I think the ankle's still going to be a concern for him, and he does derive a lot of value by getting out of the pocket, getting on the move in those plays. But if he has Tyreek Hill out there, that does change the equation quite a bit. I guess so a double-pronged question, and I'll turn to you, Alex, first. Are you trusting Patrick Mahomes with this ankle injury and also Tyreek Hill coming back into the lineup, at least theoretically, we're assuming he's going to be playing? How does that affect your interest for these guys? Because it looks like it's just going to be ownership for Hill and Kelsey, none going to Watkins, who's also, I think, got his own injury issues, none to the other guys. Are you willing to trust some Tyreek Hill coming back into the field?
So I'm not really an injury expert, so I defer to other sources for this. And the main source I'm looking at here is just the over-under and money line for this game. So, I mean, sports bettors, sports betting lines, especially like the money line, the over-under, those are pretty efficient, and they have Kansas City for about 29.5 points. So really the consensus opinion among betting markets is that Mahomes should be full strength here. And I think that Watkins being out gives Tyreek Hill, who's coming back, a nice bump from his average performance, which is already pretty good. And I have no idea how he's questionable, because you'd think with a clavicle injury, like, they would know whether he's going to play or not. I don't see how that's like under debate, but he's trending towards playing. If he does, I think he makes a really nice play.
Steve, how are you feeling about Tyreek Hill? And also, would you have any Travis Kelce interest, given that one would assume having Tyreek Hill on the field is going to help him out a bit? And we have seen Kelce, I mean, the targets have been there. Not quite as explosive this year, but maybe that's because of Hill not opening things up for him quite as much.
Right. So, yeah, Kelsey is always one of my favorite guys. The tight end depth is not super great this week. And I think Kelsey makes a good pivot off of Austin Hooper, for instance, that we talked about earlier. So, yeah, certainly interested in Kelsey. We don't know exactly what is going on with Tyreek Hill. So if Tyreek Hill comes back, I think that will help Kelsey in getting some of the attention away from him. If Tyreek Hill, doesn't come back and Watkins is out as well, then there's just going to be a wealth of targets available for Kelsey in that sense as well. So a couple of different ways that I think Kelsey can win, and like his spot quite a bit. As for like kind of the injuries on Mahomes, I am a little bit worried about that. I do agree with Alex's point on the line staying pretty strong. But just watching Mahomes against the Colts, he looked like a completely different player than what he's looked like recently, and that does worry me a little bit. He can't get out of the pocket nearly as much, and that's where we've seen him make a lot of his spectacular plays. In addition to his injury, the offensive line is a bit of a mess as well. They have Andrew Wiley and Cameron Irving that are both the left tackle and left guard. They're likely to miss the game. They're already down Eric Fisher as well, who's been out for a good part of the season. So that whole side of the line is kind of a little bit weary. So if Mahomes has trouble getting around, I think the line being in bad shape as well is, it kind of puts them in a tough spot, and that's something that I'm a bit worried about.
And Houston has been able to generate a decent pass rush, which is actually the few things that they've retained from last year. They've been worse against the run, worse in coverage, but they have been rushing pretty well. So if Mahomes is banged up, that could be an issue. But we'll find out, I guess, because I think, as you mentioned, as you guys both mentioned, the line is right there, and it has been steady, one of the top totals of the week. Not the top one, but pretty much right there. Let's talk. We usually go game by game here, but I do think with these two guys and their ownership projected, we should talk about these guys as kind of their own individual item. Leonard Fournette and Le'Veon Bell. They're both at similar price points. Both guys projected to be highly owned on all the sites, it looks like, this week. So, Steve, I'll ask you first. Bell or Fournette, which of the two would you prefer to play this week?
So I think both of them are pretty good plays in general. They have good price points. They're both on the field 90% of the time. Even sometimes they're up there at 100%. On the flip side, they both have pretty difficult matchups too. So probably of the two, I'd probably lean towards Bell a little bit. I think Fournette's matchup against New Orleans is a little bit tougher. I think that they've basically shut down, all of the running backs that they've faced so far. I think I have where did I have that stat at? Oh, I think they had held. I don't have it up here handy, but they're holding some really good players under 50 yards. I think Chris Carson, was around 50 yards. I think Ezekiel Elliott was 35 yards on 18 carries. So certainly Fournette is not better than those guys. So that's a tough one, no matter how many carries that he's getting. So I'll probably lean towards Bell.
Yeah, Fournette's been doing a great job with the opportunities that he's had. He's getting over 4.3 yards after contact, but the offensive line for Jacksonville, actually one of the poorest graded ones in the league, according to PFF. And it's actually been amazing that he's been able to pull off the performances he had. So there's certainly some risk to him. Alex, how about you? Would you prefer Fournette or Bell in the chalky but reasonably priced running back tier?
I think these guys are great plays because they just aren't priced up enough for the amount of time they spend on the field. So they're in the mid to high range, but you get a significant discount going to Fournette and Bell compared to some of the more expensive guys like Ezekiel Elliott, Kamara. So I think that they make great plays. I like Fournette a little bit more. I think that Jacksonville is projected to score about 4 more points than the Jets, and I have both teams projected to have about the same number of plays. The Jets have a bit of a tougher matchup versus Dallas, so I expect Dallas to control the game to some extent a lot of the time, where Jacksonville is a favorite versus New Orleans. So I think that is a big benefit to Fournette, and he's just been getting a crazy amount of rushing attempts. We've seen him get more than 20 on a couple of different occasions this year. And usually with running backs, after they get to 20, the production grinds to a halt because they either sub them out for other running backs, or they would usually sub them out for other running backs to keep them around 20, but that's not true with Fournette. So that gives him a ton of high upside potential.
It makes sense. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the games themselves, because you mentioned Dallas. They have a pretty high implied total for them. So we talked about Le'Veon Bell, and I assume there's not a lot of Jets love besides that. Though if I'm wrong, feel free to correct me, either of you guys. But Dallas on the other side, Ezekiel Elliott's had a quiet year so far, under 20 touches per game thus far. He hasn't had the quite big breakout games, but also some suboptimal situations, including last week with the passing game. Needed a lot more with Green Bay pulling ahead by a decent margin. Zeke's in a nice spot. Passing game here, Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, both looking really good. Gallup, arguably a more efficient, highly targeted receiver this year than Amari Cooper, but both looking good. Alex, how are you feeling about Dallas going into it? As you mentioned, they're probably going to control the game against the Jets, and the Jets have looked pretty much overmanned at every spot.
I like Elliott, but he's a little bit too high priced for my tastes, I guess, because I don't have expensive taste. I like to keep it a little bit cheap at running back.
Besides the building behind you, that's the one. The view is the expensive.
Yeah, so I think Elliott just isn't on the field as much as some of the lower price guys, which is a knock against him. And I'd probably lean towards Cooper a little bit as far as the pricing goes. But
Any Gallup interest?
I've seen a lot of people talking about Gallup, but his price is actually pretty darn high for being a wide receiver too. I have him projected a little bit higher than half of Cooper's production, so I'm not that bullish on him. But the price is pretty high, and I think if I'm going for a value play, I'd probably go elsewhere.
Steve, how are you feeling about Dallas here? Again, 26 implied points for them, one of the better totals going against the Jets team, who granted did have Luke Falk at QB, who got waived, so that's how a sign of how good he was doing. But they should theoretically be able to put up some points here. Any Dallas interest at all in guys like Zeke, Gallup, or Cooper?
Yeah, so I saw that news on Falk. That's pretty wild, right? He's the starter to waived within a couple of days. Wow. So I guess they found out what they needed to know about him.
We all did.
Yes. So yeah, I kind of agree with Alex's take on Elliott. The problem with Elliott, if we just compare him back to Le'Veon Bell, for instance, Bell basically has double the receptions for the year. They're getting similar carries per game. Now, granted, Elliott's scoring a touchdown basically every game, whereas Bell is never scoring a touchdown. But in this game head to head, they're only a 7-point favorite, I think, something like that. So there's a fair chance that it's Bell that ends up scoring the touchdown this game instead of Elliott, instead of Elliott. So for $2,100 less, going with Bell kind of makes sense in that way. So I'll probably lean more towards Bell over Elliott. If I'm looking to stack in the passing game, I like going with any of the guys. So Gallup, Cobb, Cooper, I think are all good options. And on the Jets side, I don't actually hate running it back with a guy like Robbie Anderson. We have Sam Darnold back this game without Falk, and we've seen Darnold and Anderson have some nice hookups in last year. We haven't seen that obviously this year, and Anderson's all the way down to 4,000. But if Darnold is healthy, and they might go back to finding some of their old ways as well.
Would you have any Jamison Crowder interest, Steve? Because he did have 18 targets in week 1 with Sam Darnold at QB. He hasn't quite had that success with Luke Falk, but I don't think anybody would have the success with Luke Falk. Right. So would he be something that comes up for you at all?
Yeah, I think Crowder is certainly in play. He's not going to have nearly as much upside and big play capabilities as what Anderson might have, but what he doesn't have in big play capabilities, he makes up in that number of targets that he could get. So a lot of different guys on the Jets that are kind of interesting. So Anderson, Crowder, Demaryius Thomas himself, he hasn't had any time to play with Darnold, but priced all the way down at 3,300 on DraftKings is super low. He's also quite low on Fantasydraft as well. So they have so you got 3 guys, all of them with good narratives that you can put together for a piece of how they could come up with a good game, and I might take a few shots on those.
Alex, I'll turn it to you real fast because Mark Smith in the YouTube chat asking, ask Alex and Steve if they like Darnold as a GPP play. We talked about Steve's interest or at least vague interest in these guys. Do you have any interest in Darnold as a GPP play and any of these Jet stacks, excluding Le'Veon Bell?
I probably won't be going to Darnold because there are a couple really contrarian plays I like a little bit better. The problem with Darnold is just he doesn't offer a lot in the running game. The targets are spread out between 4 different guys with Bell, Anderson, Thomas, and Crowder, so it becomes a little bit harder to stack up. But I do like Thomas. As Steve mentioned, he's just incredibly cheap on DraftKings at 3,300 and 6,200 on Fantasydraft. And in a limited sample this year for the Jets, he's gotten 11 targets on 38 routes. That is an extremely high target rate. And it's kind of in line with last year's performance for him. So I think he'll probably be out there most of the game, and that could equal a pretty good value play.
All right, let's keep going here. And we talked about this guy as well, but I feel like we should hit on the New Orleans side and probably the Jacksonville side, given that the ownership doesn't seem like it's going to be there. But I've seen a lot of people talking about D.D. Westbrook and also DJ Chark, who's stepping up to a tough matchup against Lattimore for New Orleans, who did a good job shutting down Mike Evans. Had a tough few first weeks, but it seems like he's gotten back on track. Alex, how are you feeling about Jacksonville here? DJ Chark, again, a guy who should be facing some of the toughest coverage he's faced. He's looked amazing so far, but D.D. Westbrook out of the slot, a kind of a trendy play I've seen talked about across the industry. Are you going to guys like Chark or Westbrook at all this week?
I think the rationale behind the Westbrook thing is pretty flimsy because people are saying like slot receivers have destroyed the Saints, but then you look at the list of guys and it's like Chris Godwin, like I can't remember the other ones, but then you had like Randall Cobb in there who got like 40 yards and some other guy that got 30. I mean, he's like definitely more equatable to those guys than Chris Godwin. Uh, so I think that that narrative is a little bit overblown, and I'm not that bullish on the Jacksonville passing game in general. They are decently efficient, but I just feel like Fournette is the play here, and the other guys are priced up to a pretty high price. Chark is 5,500 on DraftKings, 65 on FanDuel, and he'd be a good like value play, but he's just not that cheap.
Steve, any interest at all for you this Jacksonville passing attack, given that Chark had that monster game, but facing a tougher spot? Are you buying the D.D. Westbrook narrative that Alex did? I feel like you tore that down real efficiently, but Steve, any thoughts on that?
I don't know. It makes me kind of have to rethink my D.D. Westbrook exposures here. So here's the guy I was going to try to talk about a little bit maybe later. But I think Westbrook is actually a pretty good contrarian play. Maybe not necessarily because of he's playing in the slot, but because Marshawn Lattimore might give a lot of attention to DJ Chark, which could open up things for Westbrook a little bit more than. And I think Westbrook is every bit as good of a player as Chark. And if at the beginning of the year, a lot of people were saying he may even be better. So I think that's a way that Westbrook could kind of break out of his kind of mini slump here. And at the expense of DJ Chark. And since Chark is so high owned after last week's game, any type of exposure that you get to Westbrook kind of comes at the expense of the Chark ownership. So I think that's a good pivot play.
Yeah, certainly some leverage there if you do go to Westbrook. Whether he has a great opportunity in front of him or not, we'll find out. How about New Orleans on the other side? Steve, I'll ask you first. We've got Kamara, who's questionable right now, but I think it looks like he's going to be playing, but I guess I'm not 100% sure on that. Michael Thomas last week went off. His price is now up to where it should be. He was obscenely low priced last week, and people who played him as chalk paid off. Are you interested in Kamara or Thomas this week? I would assume not much else here, given how Teddy Bridgewater doesn't offer a lot of value to anybody besides those guys.
I think we'll have to see what the news comes on Kamara overnight before I have a strong take one way or the other. It is a little bit worrisome that they held Latavius Murray out of practice on Friday for non-injury purposes. So whatever that means, could mean that they're trying to make sure he stays healthy for the game and keeps their running back depth in attack. So that is a little bit worrisome for Kamara. If he is healthy and ready to go, I do think he's a legitimate play. Michael Thomas, sure. I always love playing Michael Thomas. I think we can kind of have a running joke with a couple of the guys on the Football Guys staff that I'm going to play him pretty much heavily each week, and he normally comes through for me. So sure, I'll throw him in some lineups.
Yeah, 11 targets per game. I feel like he'll come through more often than not for you when he's given that shot, even with Teddy Bridgewater out there. So good for him. Alex, how are you feeling about Kamara here? A questionable Kamara or Michael Thomas chasing that big game now that his price is up where it should be?
The news will be huge because I think if Kamara is out, then Latavius Murray would probably be probably the top value running back of the week. I don't think they have a lot of depth behind him. So that'll be something to watch. Kamara is priced up pretty high, so he wouldn't be my favorite play, but he might be in the mix. Have him pegged around the same projection as Bell, as Fournette. Thomas is kind of like the guy who's running hot, so I think that the logic is that if Breeze is out and Bridgewater's in, that's a pretty big hit to Thomas's value. And Thomas is priced about where he was with Breeze in, so that would mean that he's priced too high.
That makes sense. And yeah, Kamara's status and Latavius Murray, I guess, relevant to Kamara. Very important here because Jacksonville giving up 5.5 yards per rush on the year. Not looking that great versus in the run defense so far. So it could be a spot where one of those guys does go off. So I want to open the floor to you guys here because I feel like we have a couple games we haven't hit on. Seattle, Cleveland, Washington, Miami, two really illustrious teams playing. Case Keenum, the thumbnail this week, which we talked about before. Philadelphia, Minnesota, Cincinnati versus Baltimore, where Baltimore is right now the highest implied total on the week. Alex, I'll ask you first, out of those games we haven't hit on, which is the most interesting to you?
I think Washington versus Miami because it should be a competitive matchup. I don't think I'm going to end up going quite as deep as Case Keenum or Josh Rosen, but there are some individual plays I like on this game. My favorites are Chris Thompson and Adrian Peterson. I think that it'll be hard to predict which one of them gets more work. It will be kind of game flow dependent, but the coach got fired, and now they're saying they want to run the ball a ton of times. That'll be an Adrian Peterson kind of game script. Or if they're behind somehow, the Miami, Chris Thompson has been pretty effective in the passing game. So I think those are good values in a spot where they're the favorite.
Yeah, shout out to our old colleague here on the Contrary, Evan Silva, because Washington wants to establish the run, it seems, at the highest level possible with Lowell, Adrian Peterson, and possibly Chris Thompson as well. How are you feeling about these guys, Steve? Because we have a Miami team who's been terrible, giving up over 470 yards per game, giving up a ton on the ground, just looking terrible. And Washington maybe getting that fired coach bump with a guy, Bill Callahan, who's been competent before in some spots. How are you feeling about Washington, Steve?
Yeah, so basically those are the guys that I have some interest in. Case Keenum in the games that he plays so far this year, he exceeded 300 passing yards in all of them but one, and scored a touchdown and two touchdowns in two of them. So at his kind of price, I think he's a pretty good in play option, especially against the Dolphins team that has kind of been getting blown up against everybody. So I have no problems going to Case Keenum. And for the running backs, I like both of them as well.
Yeah, Peterson, a nice value play and a pivot to the ownership on Malcolm Brown that we talked about earlier. I have to ask, because Miami's also playing a poor defense. Washington's not been good either. Any Miami players at all for you, Alex? I'll ask you first.
Yeah, I think I could end up with a couple one-offs here. Kenyon Drake is probably the obvious one. He's not super cheap, though. Albert Wilson is someone that he's questionable now, but if he's a full go, like, he could be a really good play because he's been effective when he's on the field. Of course, he hasn't played at all this year pretty much, so that's a big question mark if he'd come back full strength, but it could be one that'd pay off big. But that's about it.
Steve, how about you? Any Devontae Parker, Preston Williams, the near target or the deep target for you?
Probably not a whole lot. Maybe a little bit of Kenyon Drake for similar types of reasons. Maybe a little Preston Williams, but probably not too much Parker. I guess Wilson, if he is healthy, I guess could be a reasonable option, but not super excited about the Miami side.
All right, Steve, how about the rest of these games? Any interest at all in Philadelphia, Minnesota, or Cincinnati, Baltimore? I feel like that one, given what we've seen in Cincinnati, could be an interesting one. Or Seattle, Cleveland. I guess which of those three would be the ones that you want the most?
Probably the Seattle, Cleveland game, I think, is pretty interesting. What we saw on the primetime game that last Thursday with Seattle was Russell Wilson doesn't need a lot of attempts to make a big splash. So if he has to play well and throw it a little bit more often this game, I think he could come a little bit underowned, and that they might have to against Cleveland. So I don't have any problems going to some Russell Wilson to Tyler Lockett type stacks, and maybe even playing Will Dissly a little bit there that we talked about earlier. So I finally kind of buying into him a little bit more. He's getting targeted on like 26% of the snaps that he is in. Not quite up there as much as guys like Kelsey or Kittle, who are around the 28-29% range, but 26% for a tight end is really pretty high, and they're big on him in the end zone as well. So not hating the idea of going with Dissly or Lockett with Wilson.
Alex, how are you feeling about this game? Because it seems like it could be a Cleveland bounce back spot after they pretty much puked all over themselves on a Monday night game. And Seattle, as Steve mentioned, really efficient for throwing the ball. Chris Carson also been looking a little steadier. And Cleveland's been really bad versus the rush so far on this year, giving up 150 yards per game on the ground for Cleveland, which is not good. Any interest in this game, Alex? And who would be the top guys?
I think this game has sneaky potential. I think Should be a competitive one. Cleveland obviously did terrible the last game, so maybe there's some recency bias and they could be under-owned. We're seeing that in our ownership projections to some extent. Baker Mayfield is projected to be pretty low owned. And one thing I do is I calculate the probability of each team being the top passing team of the week with my top stacks tool. And that takes into account all the different factors: how competitive the game is, how good the defenses are, what the pass rate is for each quarterback, and other stuff. And I came up with Seattle having a 5.6% chance of being the top stack, Cleveland about a 5% chance. So I have it as about 50-50 which team will be, the more likely to be the more effective in the passing game. But total 10%, and we got 10 games, so that's pretty reasonable odds for this game to be the one that wins you a GPP.
Yeah, two defenses that have not been that great, and they could be an Odell Beckham bounce back spot. He got shut down last week on the outside, which has been happening every outside receiver versus San Francisco. But Seattle's been pretty bad overall, defending really everything, and could be a spot for these guys to get back on track. All right, let's close it out. Of course, guys, hit that like button. Thank you again to Fantasy Draft, fantasydraft.com. Use that promo code AWESEMO to play in the world of rake-free daily fantasy. All of the contest fees in there are going to the winners, and that's what you want to see out of your DFS sites. So go support the show. Go support Fantasy Draft right now. Go to fantasydraft.com because we're all playing there. A lot more people playing there every week, and that's, even though it's not great for you as a player, it is still a spot where you should be playing there because it's rake-free and there's nothing else in the industry like it. So go check out the Hooters main event and support the show and use that promo code AWESEMO. And of course, Awesemo Plus as well. Go to awesemo.com/join. That top stacks tool that Alex just mentioned, that is included with your Awesemo membership. So go to awesemo.com/join. Use promo code contrary for half off your first month. All right, it's that time, guys. Contrarian picks, a real up and down. We're running hot, we're running cold with these, but this week, I believe in all of us getting on track and doing a good job. So Alex, I'll ask you first. Your contrarian QB pick for week 6, who would it be?
I'll give a quick plug to Fantasy Draft first because
Sure.
I've been really enjoying playing on there with the rig free. Our friend Adam Scher, one of our big NBA and MLB analysts, won 100K on their main event the other week. And I was kind of upset about that because I finished in 3rd, so he bumped me down a spot. But I was still happy because on Fantasy Draft I actually got 30K, which is 30% of the top prize for 3rd. If you look at the payout structures on other sites, you're getting maybe 15% of the top prize for 3rd. So that was $15,000 more I made because I was in a Fantasy Draft tournament compared to a different tournament. So you just win more money at the times you cash on Fantasy Draft, and that's huge. My super QB, I got 2 of them. So let me know. Do you guys want like something that's contrarian or like a super deep cut here?
Steve, you're the guest. I defer to you.
Oh, we got to go with the super deep cut, I would say.
All right.
I would agree.
I wanted to give you the option because this one might be a little too deep for you guys. You might have to talk me out of this one, but it's Andy Dalton. I think that this is he was popular last week and really disappointed. Very tough matchup versus Baltimore, so I expect him to be one of the least popular quarterbacks this week. But the injuries are really piling up. You got John Ross on the IR. AJ Green still hasn't played a game yet this season. And what that ends up leaving is you got Tyler Boyd and Alden Tate, and both being like a large percentage of the offense for passing. So I think those 2 plays are pretty reasonable. Boyd is kind of a one-off or as part of a stack. And then Tate is kind of a sleeper play. And if both of those guys go off, then I think Andy Dalton could win your GPP.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I was on Dalton last week. It did not pay off. He was fine though. Like, even though he had like his overall output wasn't great, but he ended up having a couple field goals that took away his shots in the beginning because they just couldn't punch it in the red zone. Baltimore's defense has been bad this year. 280 yards allowed per game through the air. I feel like that's one thing that's been a little bit underrated. Sack rate also pretty down. So I think you're not crazy. But Steve, what do you think? Andy Dalton, and who would be your contrarian QB pick?
Yeah, Auden Tate is kind of interesting, right? I mean, he's like hardly any ownership this week after being like 30% owned last week. What's really changed so much in the picture? I'm not sure a whole lot. So sure, yeah, I like that take. It's a good deep cut take. Hopefully mine is equally as deep cut. The guy I'm thinking about is Case Keenum. So talked a little bit about him earlier. He has had multiple 300-yard games already this season, playing one of the weakest defenses in the league, multiple touchdowns every week so far this year. And he's also has the backing of Bill Callahan. So right after Callahan was announced as interim head coach, he said, we're going back to Keenum, and we have no hesitations to doing so. The one thing that will worry a lot of people is, Keenum was benched his last game, but really it's not something that we should be super concerned about in the DFS community. If your player ends up getting benched, they weren't going to win you a tournament anyways because they weren't playing well. So that's not something that should really be a concern in the back of our mind if someone's going to get benched or not. So I think Keenum is certainly in play, and we'll go with that.
Yeah, I like Keenum too. So he was in my my qualifying group too. I think he's been better on the year than people realize. But I'm going to go to Baker Mayfield because he's actually less owned. And to me, this is the time. We saw him at his worst. I still think he's going to have some struggles on the year. They have trouble keeping him clean. His accuracy has fallen off a cliff. But I think these things can bounce back. And Seattle's given up enough yards per game. Really hasn't graded out too well in pass coverage, where I think he can have a big day just by getting the ball to Landry and Beckham in space. And see how that pans out. Steve, I'll ask you now, turn it back so you get the first pick. Contrarian running back pick. Who would it be?
Great. So I'm going to stick with the same game here. So Washington, the other thing that Callahan mentioned pretty heavily was, we wanted to establish the run, as you mentioned earlier. So I think that's a legitimate case for Adrian Peterson, as well as Chris Thompson also. So I'll actually take a shot on both of those guys. If Keenum ends up hitting as my quarterback option, it's very likely that Chris Thompson will be involved, and he can do well. If instead the narrative is that they're going to run the ball more and Adrian Peterson is going to be able to carry the load the way that he used to be able to back in the day, and that's what Callahan wants, then he's an option as well. So but in all three cases, the price is right and the defense that they're going against is right. So I don't have a problem taking a shot on any of them.
Alex, how about you? Who'd be your contrarian running back pick?
So this is actually a game we haven't mentioned yet. One that I think will be more popular for the defenses than anything is we got this Denver versus Tennessee game. And the guy I'm liking this week as a contrarian play is Royce Freeman. He's kind of flown under the radar this year because he hasn't had any big fantasy games. But his workload has gone up a lot. He's getting about like 40 to 45%. Lindsey's getting about 55%. But the ownership on the two is Lindsey 2-1 in favor of Freeman. So I think that if it's a hot hand situation like I'm expecting and Freeman is doing well, then he could win you a tournament just because of his low ownership.
Yeah, Freeman seeing 14 touches a game and really not much less effective than Philip Lindsay is, even though the expectation is that he's been a bit of a disappointment. I'll actually, because Peterson was going to be my guy, I'm glad that I'm actually on the same page with Steve with this. That makes me feel better about my Washington love. But I'll go to Derrick Henry in that same game, just because I think this game's going to be a bit of a slog, and I think they probably won't have to pass as much. I think Henry's going to have the opportunity to not get blown off the field, to not lose that game flow. He's still running at a good amount, not going to contribute a lot in terms of targets, but at his price point, he is a pivot to some guys like Bell and Fournette. And if they happen to fail and Henry has a decent day at low ownership, that could be a move that ends up paying off. So why not? Alex, contrarian wide receiver to close it out.
Another game we haven't really talked about too much, but Philadelphia, they have a tough matchup this week versus the Vikings. Probably a low-score game, one with the lower over-unders in the week, but one off I like from this game is Alshon Jeffrey. We still have Deshaun Jackson out, so there's less competition for targets. He's been getting 8 targets a game, which is pretty good. Minnesota is not good at sustaining drives, so I think Philadelphia will have plenty of chances in this game. And he's playing almost every snap. So I think that if Philadelphia has to throw the ball a lot to try to win this game, like I expect, then Alshon Jeffrey has a pretty good shot of hitting, and he's going to be very low owned.
Steve, how about you? Contrarian wide receiver.
I'm going to go with Day Westbrook for a lot of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. I think the fact that Lattimore is really going to kind of latch on to DJ Chark is really going to do a lot for me, because it's going to open up the game for Westbrook, and it's going to allow me to pass over a lot of the folks that own Chark when he underperforms his projections. So I think Westbrook makes a good leverage play at a low owned rate. And I think this is kind of the week that we finally get to see Westbrook live up to some of that preseason hype that he'd been supposed to be living up to.
Yeah, I think that checks out. I'll go Mohamed Sanu. He's a little bit over. I mean, he's a little bit overowned for where we like for the contrarian wide receiver. Still under 10%, and I think people don't realize getting 7 targets a game. He'll be running out of the slot, which should be the most favorable matchup for him going against Arizona. And I think he's a logical pivot to the higher owned guys like Hooper and Julio Jones. So I'm willing to get some Sanu in there, and he's had good weeks even when he hasn't scored touchdowns. So I don't mind Sanu. And I forgot, of course, we have to close it out with our fade of the week. That is the most important part here, the one that we leave ourselves the most vulnerable with. Alex, who is your fade of the week?
This is the one I love because it's the one where we can get in trouble here.
Like our famous Austin Eckler, who was the Wayne Gallman week? Yeah, that was a tough one.
Yeah, one of my weekly rituals is walking back this fade of the week sometime before Sunday walk. But my fade of the week this time, I'm pretty confident about. It's Dalvin Cook. We have him as about the 12th most popular player on the slate, and he's been hot fire this year. He's been amazing, but the Vikings have a little bit of a tough matchup versus the Eagles this week. You're paying top dollar for Cook now, and he is splitting the work to some extent with Alexander Madison. So I think that he's just not as good for the salary as Leonard Fournette, Bell, and some other guys. So I just don't see myself ending up on Cook here.
All right, Steve, how about you? Who'd be your fade? Or the favorite party, or the one you get to be on the spot? Who's your fade of the week?
I think I'll go with Zeke Elliott. He's had a touchdown in every game but one so far this year, so I have a pretty good chance of having to walk this one back a little bit. But if he doesn't get in the end zone, I think he has a good chance of underperforming his salary, because he's not super heavily involved in the passing game like some of the other running backs. His touches are down a little bit this year. Last year he was at about 21 per game. This year he's down in around 17. He's actually only gone even over his average of 21 once this year. That was in week 2 when they were really trying to ramp up his work. But now that they've seen how good Dak Prescott is playing this year, they've been a little bit more open to throwing in. And I think the ownership for Elliott is quite high. The price is quite high. And I'd rather take a different route.
Yeah, actually, so one thing that'll help us out, by the way, it's hard to be more wrong with Fade of the Week than Chris Randone was last week with Christian McCaffrey. And Chris is a fantastic guy, to be clear, not busting his faults too much, but so I think we're clear as long as we don't do that. So I'll play it safe. I'll go with Malcolm Brown. I just don't think he's in that great of a spot overall, and I really do believe in the San Francisco defense. I think they're going to show big. I think this is their statement game coming in. I think they're saying all the right stuff. I mean, that's a narrative thing and not a data thing, but I just like the way they look and what they're bringing to the table, and I think they can actually really oppress this Rams team, who's banged up and going to be missing Todd Gurley. So that's it. All right, Steve, the floor is yours. Obviously, you're over at Football Guys. You're also at Steve Buzzard on Twitter, so go follow at Steve Buzzard right now. But Steve, plug whatever you want. The floor is yours.
Sure. Yeah. So definitely come check out our stuff over at footballguys.com. Over there, I do our ownership projections. Spend a lot of time each and every week on making those as accurate as possible. I think ownership projections are the one key thing that you can do to win contest each week. So I think they're the most important route to go. You know who's popular, so you can know who's a good play quickly. Sometimes you can't really tell that looking at projections, but ownership projections, you can tell that pretty quickly. Also write an article over there as well, talking about some GPP strategy. We have a lot of good stuff going on over there. So really looking forward to that. Looking forward to hopefully our contrarian picks coming through, and check me out on Twitter as well. So that's about it.
Yeah, go follow at Steve Buzzard. Check out all the stuff that Football Guys does. They do a great job breaking down the sport and also making it very approachable. And guys like Steve, a lot of success in your past, and you're bringing that every week to your content. So it's going to be a lot of help for the people out there. So go check that out. And Alex, any parting words for us before we call it quits here on our Week 6 preview?
Yeah, Steve, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I know you're one of the best players out there because I keep seeing you at all these live events, and you just had your takedown last year in addition to the Sunday Million win. I mean, that was a terrific season, so wouldn't be surprised at all if you do it again this season. One of my hobbies happens to be dominating GPPs, so I'll be checking out your article, GPP Domination, on Football Guys for sure. And thanks everyone for watching. Thanks Chris for hosting the show. Thanks Fantasy Draft for being a sponsor, and check out the main event this week. And also, I'll be going on the office hours in our premium Slack to answer questions right following this.
Yeah, so go right over to the premium Slack now. Go to osmo.com/join to get the package as low as $3.95 a week. But find one that has premium Slack, because Alex does a great job in that office hours period, bringing the info to all you guys. But we appreciate the support. Hit that like button before you go, because it helps us keep the lights on. And we'll see you guys again soon. So good luck in week 6, guys. See you. Bye.